Hello, I'm Gina Myers, and I'm here with the Ready Garden Grow vegetable gardening series. And today I'll be talking about planting and harvesting your garden. The Master Gardener volunteers work with NC Extension to provide gardeners with unbiased, research-based information on gardens, lawns, and landscapes. We would love it if you would follow our Wake County Master Gardener Facebook page. And if you have any questions for Master Gardeners about your lawn and garden, you can contact them by telephone at 919-250-1084 or by email at mgardner@wakegov.com. In this series of classes, we have talked about the basics of what you need to grow vegetables, from planting your garden through growing vegetables in containers. And today we'll be on the 5th module, which is planting and harvesting. In this class, I will cover when to plant your garden, when to use seeds, or when you might prefer to use transplants, how to plant seeds and transplants, and how to harvest your vegetables, the fun part. So you have prepared your soil, have the beds built, you have a planting plan in place, and so now it's time to plant your garden. This is the fun part. The first question that you want to think about is when to plant. So it's very tempting as a gardener to want to get your plants in the ground as soon as you can in the spring. But we want to encourage everyone to wait at least until the average last frost date, which is around mid-April. But remember, this is just an average. So you have to pay attention to the local weather, what the projections are for the next week or two, and then judge whether you want to just hold off a little bit. Remember, those warm season plants like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, they all really love the soil to be warm. They love warm temperatures. So you're not really gaining a lot of advantage by putting them in super early in the spring. So just wait until you have good warm temperatures for those summer crops. Now for the fall crops, we'll be preparing in August or September when it's really hot for those plants that actually prefer cooler weather. So, you'll have to judge when you can actually put them in to make sure it's not too hot for them. So there is some flexibility on either side, but we want to think about what's going to make those different plants happiest. Now, the summer crops will oftentimes grow right up until frost. I still have tomatoes in the garden in October and peppers, but as soon as there's a frost, they will fall to pieces. So you want to make sure that you harvest your summer crops before the first frost. Each year is going to be a little bit different, so don't get set on a date. Make sure that you check in with the weather. Now, the common crop chart will have all this information on it in terms of estimates of when you might plant these crops. So check that and get your preparations in place for the crops that you're going to be growing. We do want to recommend that you clean out the previous crop debris because sometimes there can be insects or diseases that will stay onto plants. And in fact, I recommend that you pull them out as soon as you're done with plants. Even if they kind of look nice sitting out in your garden, you're better off removing them if you've already harvested what you're going to harvest from them. They're not doing any good in the garden, and they could be harboring diseases or insects. Also, weeds are a good host crop for a lot of insects. So it's not just an aesthetic thing where you want your garden to look nice and neat. You're actually reducing some of the insect populations if you keep it nicely weeded. We do want to remember our crop rotations, why that's important for disease and pest management. And fortunately, most of the cool season crops are in different families than the ones we've planted in the summer. But even within the cool season crops, there are a few different families. So you want to pay attention to their rotations. And then also you're going to be putting some of those same crops in the spring. So you do still want to pay attention to crop rotations whenever you can. Now, as far as mulching, we always recommend that you have some cover on the soil because it will help insulate from very cold or very hot temperatures. It also keeps the soil moist, and even in the wintertime, we need some soil moisture to have healthy plants. And it also keeps the weeds down. So there are several good reasons to mulch. You can use pine straw, pine bark mulch, hardwood mulch, leaf mold or leaf mulch, which I really like. I think it's got a nice texture for the surface of the soil. So there are a number of mulches, but you just want to pick one. You want to keep it away from the stems of the plants because that can touch the plants and maybe have moisture levels that are too high. It may predispose them to diseases. So keep them an inch or two away from the stem of the vegetable plants. Seeds, there are a million different varieties. It can be so exciting to look at a seed catalog and to pick out all kinds of varieties of seeds. And you should experiment. But it's also wise to use some varieties that are recommended, tried and true varieties for the South. Because here in the Southeast, we have high disease and insect pressure because it's very moist here and warm. So try different varieties of the flavors of some of these different lettuces, for instance. There's a whole bunch of different choices there. Tomatoes, sure, try some of those out. But to ensure that you have a crop, it's good to plant some of our tried and true varieties, and those will be in the crop chart. But seeds will keep different amounts of time. So the note at the bottom, the sell-by date, is important to take note of. Certain seeds will only last a year or so. Spinach and I think beet seeds usually are only good for about a year. Some of them, like lettuce seeds, will keep several years, and tomato seeds will keep several years. So check that to make sure that you have the proper date, planting dates or freshness date for your seeds. And then also in terms of storing them, it's important to keep them in a dry, cool place. You may have a place like that in your home, or you may want to put them in your refrigerator, in which case you would put them in kind of a tightly sealed Tupperware, maybe with some dry rice at the bottom, and just make sure it's tightly sealed, and then they will keep better until the next planting season. The seed packets themselves will give you all kinds of information, when to plant them outside or inside if the season isn't quite right. But remember, those planting dates may not be the same for all parts of the country. So you're going to want to refer back to our North Carolina Common Crop chart in order to get best planting dates. And it will also give you information on the planting depth and how dense you should plant them and those kinds of information. So take a look at that seed pack. It does have a lot of information, and then make sure that you also reference that against our local information. There are several different ways you can plant. Probably the key thing is to not plant them too deep. So just think about the size of your seed, and generally they say plant them 1 to 2 times the greatest diameter of that seed. So you can imagine for very tiny seeds like lettuce or radishes, you're not going to be planting them very deep at all. In fact, sometimes I just kind of stir them around a little bit in the soil or spray them with a light watering sprinkle so that they're just very close to the surface. Some of the other seeds like cucumbers, beans, squash, those can be planted, ½ inch or 1 inch into the soil, and it won't hurt them. They'll emerge. They have plenty of power in that seed to bust through the soil. The actual planting techniques, you can plant them in a row just by digging a little furrow, and this is what I do with my beans. I just go straight down a furrow, or what else? Cucumbers I may plant this way. Banding is when you dig kind of a wider, shallower trench and you sprinkle seeds across the trench. And this might be good for something like lettuce, where you want to plant it pretty densely, but of course you don't want it too close together so that they can't grow, but you might actually be planting it, come and cut and come again, and want plants kind of densely located together. Hilling is when you just scoop some soil up into a hill and then you plant a few seeds right in the top of that. And this is usually done for plants like squash or zucchini, some melons. And just remember that all those seeds may well germinate, and those are big plants. So keep it to 2 or 3 seeds for a hill, or you're going to end up with overcrowded plants. And then drilling is where you actually just poke a hole and you stick a seed in it. And I might do this for beans or some of the larger seeds as well. So it depends on the seed, but just remember not to plant those little tiny seeds too deep. That's going to be a challenge if they can't break through the soil. The other challenge that we face when we have success, when we get a lot of seeds germinating, is that now we have to go in and thin them out. So it's critical that you thin out seedlings. If you will try this once and then you realize it can be a problem if you don't, because the plants will end up being very scrawny and packed in, and you won't get a really robust plant that ever grows. It's hard to imagine that these little tiny seedlings are going to ever grow into a big lettuce head, or, you know, a big tomato plant even, but they will. So you have to go in and thin them out, and you will thin them depending on what plant they are. And that information will be on the back of the seed packet. It will also be in the Ready Garden Grow manual. So the thing they recommend is to trim them rather than pulling them. If they're far enough apart, you can actually pull out the little excess seedlings, but sometimes you have to trim them in order to keep from messing up the other seedlings there. So it's better to do when they're very young, because this is when they're developing their initial strength. So go in when they start to emerge and are an inch or two tall, start to thin them out. If you're a person who loves to grow from seeds, then that's great. You're going to plan ahead, you're going to pick out all the seeds you want, and you're going to plant them. Some of us don't have enough time or the proper place to do that, and prefer to go shopping at the store and just pick out our transplants. And this is great. You can go buy them and plant them the same day. That sort of works for me. What you want to make sure of, though, is that you never ever select transplants that are not healthy. This is a huge mistake. You'll be bringing either problem plants if they're not vigorous, if they just don't have the fertility they need, they look scrawny. But more importantly, you might be bringing a disease into your garden. And sometimes these are soil-borne diseases. So once you bring them in, you'll have them. So you never want to bring home a plant that looks yellow, if it looks excessively tall and scrawny. And in this picture, I see some that aren't exactly ideal. Those purple cabbage plants there look pretty tall and scrawny to me. I might not select those. Certainly, if you see anything with spots or dead leaves on them, anything that doesn't reflect a good state of vigor, I would just leave them at that store and go somewhere else and try and find them. You also want to take a look, peek around the leaves, look under them, make sure that they don't have aphid infestations or thrips or some other insect that could be a problem once it gets home. Don't think that you're going to cure a plant only by healthy plants. even these healthy transplants that you bring home may not have been in full sun. So you want to make sure that when you get them home, you give them a day or two, if they haven't been in full sun, to acclimatize to your garden. You might put them out in the sun for a few hours and then put them in the cooler, shadier area. You want to plant them after you have totally soaked your garden. Make sure that the soil is damp, very deep. And then, unlike trees, where we want to plant those oftentimes above the soil level, above ground, we want to plant our vegetables usually right at soil level. So it's just going to be even with your soil, and make sure that the roots are fully teased out, and so they're ready to spread out into the garden and not bunched up into a ball. It's better to tear them a little bit than to plant them in a bunch, because they may stay in that bunch all season and never be able to break out of it. So loosen those roots up good, spread them out, put the plant in the ground, soil level, lightly tamp the soil around it, and then water it. Water it within 5 minutes. Don't let it go any longer than that. And if you happen to be planting into those little peat or fiber pots, make sure that it's actually buried a little bit, because if that pot sits at all above ground or above grade, the water won't tend to really soak it, and so it will keep that little plant dry, and it will never break down. The peat won't break down and the plant won't break out. So if you do have them in those little pots, make sure they are completely buried. Tomatoes are the one plant that are different, and they've got this great quality where they will send out roots from their stems. So if you happen to have tomatoes that are a little bit tall and gangly, maybe you planted them a little too early and they've not had as much sun as they needed, and so they're kind of tall and sparse looking, you can actually dig the hole and then also kind of dig a trench off to the side and lay the tomato in that trench and cover it up with soil, and it will eventually right itself and grow straight up, and will root from that stem, and you'll have a stronger plant because it will have grown from the soil as a shorter, smaller plant rather than that tall, gangly one. So yeah, keep that in mind about tomatoes. And even later in the season, you can pinch off a healthy tomato stalk and either put it in water for a few days, or sometimes you can just plant them directly if it's not broiling hot out. And it will take root, and you can have another tomato plant, which is a really cool thing that tomatoes do. Watering is a critical part of this planting season, whether they're seeds or whether they're transplants. So you'd like a soft watering on your seeds, because they're very, the tiny ones are sort of close to the surface, and you want to just keep them moist. You're going to have to water seeds in warm weather every single day. You may go 2 days if it's very cool weather, like in the fall, and you have, drizzle or whatever. But if it's warm out, you're going to have to water those seeds every day, because once they start germinating, they have to have moisture until they've developed enough roots to actually go down into the soil. Otherwise, they'll just bake on that surface of the soil and die. So the other point is that you want to make sure you soak them well. Put your finger in the soil, test it. A lot of times you'll think you've watered adequately, but you may not have. It's just not, it takes longer than you think it does to get that water down in there. So check it with your finger. It should be damp, at least down to your second finger joint. And what this also does, by keeping them moist every day, is it avoids this crusting of the soil, which for those little tiny lettuce seeds or other small seeds, it's very difficult for them to bust through that crust. So every day for seeds. For transplants, you also have to keep them well watered, particularly in warm weather. And if I have planted tender transplants in the spring and suddenly we have a 90-degree day, I want to make sure that they get a little shade too. So I have these row covers. You could use a sheet, you could use an umbrella, you can use whatever, but they might need a little bit of shade for a day or two until they just start putting out some roots and can actually take up enough water to keep from burning. So just think of transplants. If it's a really hot day, you might have to provide them a little bit of shade just for a day or two. You do want to make sure you water them deeply, because the whole goal is to get those roots to grow deep. So if you water them just a tiny bit every day, then the roots don't have any incentive to go deep, and they will tend to stay shallow, and that's not what you want. You want them to search for water. So water them deeply and encourage those roots to go down. And the same thing goes for ongoing watering. The recommendation is 1 inch of water per week to a depth of 6 inches. And I will tell you that if you put your finger in the soil, you will be surprised almost every time that it's not really wet that deep. So once your plants are established, you're going to really make sure that they get a deep watering 2 or 3 times a week. And of course, if we're having 100-degree days, you're going to have to do it more than that. We just want to avoid that frequent shallow watering because, again, that makes the roots stay towards the surface and doesn't really help them explore the nutrients that are down deeper in the soil. It's recommended to water either in the evening or in the morning. The morning is actually the best because then the plant leaves, if they're damp, will have a chance during the day to actually dry out. And that reduces the chances of diseases, foliar diseases. You can water in the evening, especially if you're able to water just the roots rather than showering all of the plant leaves, which again, can contribute to plant disease. You will have to water more in hot weather than in cool weather, that is for sure. But even if we have a super dry winter, you may need to go out and give your plants a squirt of water. If it doesn't rain for 2 or 3 weeks, those plants are not going to flourish in cool temperatures. We like drip irrigation because it delivers water right to the soil, not to the leaves. It's also really efficient because you have a lot less evaporation from the surface of the soil. So that water is just dripping straight down into it. We recommend that you mulch always. This protects the soil. It keeps the soil temperature either cooler or warmer, depending on what you want. It keeps water in the soil, and it also reduces the weeds. So just remember to keep some covering on that soil. If you've done everything right, or at least partly right, you're going to have a bounty of vegetables to harvest. So let's finish today with a brief discussion on the harvesting side of things. You want to harvest plants at maturity. Now, they will have notes in the planting charts and the planting plans as to when you should anticipate this, but really it is going to mean going out in your garden, checking those vegetables, seeing what looks just right at its peak. And what, the desire for this, the whole reason we garden is so that we can eat our vegetables at the peak of their flavor. And the minute you pick a vegetable, it starts to decline in, some of its flavors and sugars start to break down. So we want to harvest it when it's at its peak, but not too late, because of course we've missed the boat on that. Some vegetables are more flexible than others about when they can be harvested. Tomatoes are pretty obvious about when to harvest, as are beans. I think you can look at a bean and say, well, I'd rather eat it this size than that size. So that's pretty direct. And they change rapidly, beans do. Zucchini is another one that changes rapidly. You miss one day and you may have one the size of a football. So you do have to keep an eye on it if you want to catch them at that ideal age. Other ones are a little more flexible, like peppers. They may transition from a green pepper to a red pepper, but both are fine. So there's not as much drama with peppers. Eggplants are a little bit tricky, I think, in that you have to test there's a lot of variety, so they grow different sizes. And then if you harvest them too small, they're too firm and not that tasty. And if you leave them on too long, they'll get soft and start getting brown interiors. So you're just going to have to get to know the variety that you planted and when to pick them at their ideal time. Others are a little trickier, like sweet potatoes, because they're under the ground. You can't see them, but there are some guidelines for that. If you start to see their leaves change color in the fall, and you want to avoid frost, of course, for all warm weather crops. And so yeah, there is some flexibility in there, but I encourage you to let them get to their full maturity. My blueberries, I will go out and pick them maybe the day before optimal time period, because if I wait till the optimal time period, the birds will get them. So you'll learn when to get out there and pick. There's all different ways to harvest what you need and to share your excess harvest. So we put ours out on a big tray, and our neighbors come by and take whatever extra we have, or you may find a local food pantry that could use your extra produce. It is important to harvest in the cool part of the day, and morning is ideal because the fruits and vegetables have accumulated their moisture from the evening, the cooler temperatures in the evening, and so they're nice and turgid, and they're not stressed out from the heat. Also remember that as soon as you pick them, they are going to start declining, but you can slow that decline by moving them somewhere cool immediately. And that may not be the refrigerator. Not all plants, not all vegetables are supposed to be kept in the refrigerator. But you can look that up and figure out which ones are. And but regardless, you want to move them somewhere cool. Don't leave them sitting out in the sun in a bowl more than 5 minutes. So just pick them, get them somewhere cool. For more information on planting and harvesting, there is a guide specific to the Piedmont for vegetables and herbs. So check that out. It's an NC State publication. Harvesting methods can vary, and there are 3 main ways that we'll show you here. The first is cutting the vegetable off the plant. And in this way, you would use scissors or pruners or a knife to actually get the vegetable off the stem. And as you garden more and you get more experience, you may find that there are some vegetables you can snap off very carefully with your hands and with no problem. Like beans, cucumbers, I can usually just snap off without a problem. I unfortunately have ruined too many pepper plants by thinking, oh, I'll just bend this fruit up and snap it off the plant. And instead, I ended up tearing up the whole stem. And, that's just really heartbreaking when you have this beautiful plant, you have maybe another month that you could harvest from it, and you've just torn it practically in half. So I encourage you to use an implement until you gain some confidence about what you can harvest. Eggplants are really hard to harvest without cutting them off. Squash, you can easily slice off with a knife and will have no problem. And tomatoes, sometimes you can snap them off if they're very ripe, but again, you're going to take the chance of perhaps tearing up your vine. The next thing is to actually pull the plant out. This is common sense, I think, for some of our root crops. You have to pull them out of the ground. There's no easy way to do that there's no other way to do that other than just pulling them out. Carrots, head lettuce, because you're eating the whole crop, you're going to just pull it out. And then we have our cut and come again type of vegetable growing, which I love to do, where you kind of intensively seed a part of your garden bed or a large container, and so that you eat the vegetable leaves, and oftentimes it is leaves, it can be radishes or something, but where you will plant them intensively and then just cut off a section all at once. Like I might go out with scissors or a knife and cut a square foot of leafy material, avoiding the growing point, so that as soon as I've cut it, I can water them and they'll start growing again. But I have enough for dinner, and then in a couple days I can go in and cut another section, and they'll just keep growing over the season. So there are different ways you can treat them depending on what your intention is. You can also grow leafy greens and just let them get a little more, provide them with more room, and then harvest just individual leaves as you go. And I'll do this with lettuce or arugula or spinach. Just harvest the leaves as they mature individually. Storing your harvest, of course, fresh is best. But then we have the quandary of when everything comes in at once, what do we do with it? We can give it away. And there are other ways we can handle it. We can freeze it, can it, pickle it, dry it. It's really going to depend ultimately on how much you love that vegetable and how much trouble you're going to go to preserve it. And over the years, you've figured that out. Canning is one that you have to be particularly careful of to make sure that you do that exactly properly so that it's not a health hazard. Otherwise, you can experiment with freezing methods. Sometimes you blanch the vegetables, and sometimes you can just freeze them directly. Pickling, of course, requires safe food handling methods, and drying can work. The challenge with drying here in the South is that we have a lot of moisture in our air. So even if you dry them thoroughly, just because of our ambient humidity, you may get some molds on them. So sometimes I will dry tomatoes or blueberries or figs, and then I will package them, bag them up and freeze them, just to keep them from getting moldy. So there are a number of ways, and for more information on, there's a publication called Home Food Preservation by NC State University. So in this section, we have talked about when to plant your garden, the time of year, and when to use seeds or transplants, how to plant the seeds and your transplants, and how to harvest your vegetables. The next module in this series is managing common problems. And if you have questions, please call the Master Gardeners at 919-250-1084 or email them at mgardner@wakegov.com. The Ready Garden Grow Handbook, from which much of this information is derived, is on our Wake County Cooperative Extension website. And a lot of that material came directly from the Extension Gardener Handbook, which is a comprehensive gardening text that you have free access to online, or you can purchase a hard copy. And if you'll just Google Extension Gardener Handbook, you will find that on the web. Thank you for participating in the Ready Garden Grow series, and we will see you in the garden and in our next class, Managing Common Problems.